After a 2-day blizzard, an old forest ranger finds a frozen bear cub trapped in an abandoned pickup truck. The man, consumed by his own grief, embarks on a rescue mission that will not only save a life but prove that a debt of kindness can be repaid in the most unbelievable way. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight. Roads turned into rivers, fields into swamps, and the creek behind Carter's cabin roared like something alive. Carter wasn't one to panic. Years in the forest had taught him that nature had its rhythm, and sometimes it hit hard. But this storm? It felt different. The air crackled like it was watching. Carter had just stepped out to check the levee behind his property when he heard it, sharp, panicked barking cutting through the rain. It wasn't just any bark. It was the kind of sound an animal makes when it's trapped between survival and surrender. He ran. The current was fierce, branches and debris tumbling through the brown water. And there, on a slab of half-submerged concrete near the flooded edge of the woods, was a dog, or what he thought was a dog. Soaked, trembling, eyes wide with fear. Its fur was matted, blackened with mud, and it let out a low whine as Carter approached. Without hesitation, Carter waded in. The current fought him at every step. His boots filled with water, and each movement felt like dragging a weight through cement. Still, he pushed forward, arms outstretched. "It's okay, boy. I got you," he said, his voice steady. As his fingers touched the dog's scruff, the creature froze. Then, slowly, it leaned into his arms, too willingly. As if it had been waiting. As if it knew. Carter hoisted it up, one arm under its chest, the other supporting its hind legs. The weight was wrong. Not heavy, but dense, like something compressed and coiled. He carried it home. Inside the cabin, he laid the dog gently on a pile of old towels by the fireplace. Thunder cracked outside. The power flickered and died. Only the dim orange glow of the fire remained. The creature didn't move. Carter fetched a bowl of water, a strip of jerky from the pantry, and sat beside it. Up close, the details began to emerge. Its fur was thick but oddly textured, almost scale-like beneath the outer layer. Its eyes, he hadn't noticed before, weren't brown or blue like most dogs. They were amber. Luminous. Reflective. As if lit from within. And then it blinked. Slow. Deliberate. "Guess you've been through hell too," Carter whispered. The dog, if that's what it was, drank from the bowl. But it didn't lap like a normal dog. It sipped. Precise. Controlled. Observing him the whole time. A flash of lightning lit up the room. In that instant, the creature's shadow flickered on the far wall. Carter's breath caught. The shadow didn't look like a dog. It stood tall, upright. Like a person. Long limbs. Elongated neck. And eyes that shimmered like coins under moonlight. Carter turned, heart pounding. But the creature was still curled on the floor, head resting on its paws. He blinked hard. Maybe he was tired. Maybe the adrenaline and storm had tricked his mind. Still, he didn't sleep that night. And neither did the dog. He walked quickly but carefully to his workshop, a converted barn where he kept his woodworking tools and where a potbelly stove had been burning low all morning. The space was warm but not overheated, and Harold knew from his training that thermal shock could be as dangerous as hypothermia for a severely chilled animal. He cleared a space near the stove and laid out several clean cloth sacks that smelled of sawdust and pine. Gently, he placed the bear cub on this makeshift bed, positioning it far enough from the heat source to allow for gradual warming. The cub's breathing was so faint that Harold had to lean close to be sure it was still alive. Its small black nose was dry and cracked, and its eyes were sealed shut with the exhaustion of near death. Harold settled into his old wooden chair, a piece he'd built himself 20 years earlier, and began his vigil. He'd learned patience in the forest, where rushing could mean the difference between life and death for an injured animal. His eyes never left the cub's small form, watching for any change in breathing pattern, any sign of improvement or decline. The workshop was quiet except for the crackling of the fire and the subtle whistle of wind through the gaps in the barn siding. As the hours passed, Harold found himself talking to the unconscious cub in the same low, steady voice he'd once used to calm frightened animals during his ranger days. He told stories about the forest, about the changing seasons, and about the bear families he'd observed over the years. He spoke about Maggie, too, describing how she used to leave scraps for the wildlife and how she'd insisted on hanging bird feeders where she could watch them from the kitchen window. The first sign of improvement came near sunset, when the cub's breathing deepened slightly and its body seemed to relax rather than remain rigidly curled. Harold felt a surge of hope mixed with anxiety. He'd seen animals rally briefly before succumbing, and he knew the next 24 hours would be critical. That night, he slept in the workshop, wrapped in an old sleeping bag, waking every hour to check on his patient. By the second day, the cub's eyes had begun to open periodically, though they remained unfocused and glassy. Harold had managed to get a few drops of water into its mouth using a small spoon, and the animal had reflexively swallowed. On the third day, the cub lifted its head for the first time and looked directly at him. The moment their eyes met, Harold felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief that had lived there since Maggie's death. Through days of silent care that stretched into weeks, Harold gradually realized something important about the nature of his loneliness. It wasn't simply the absence of people around him, but the absence of genuine connection and purpose. The bear cub, though unable to speak, brought him a sense of being needed that he had lost when Maggie died. Caring for this small creature gave structure to his days and meaning to his actions in ways he hadn't experienced since his retirement from the Forest Service. The relationship that developed between them was unlike anything Harold had experienced. It was built on trust earned in increments through patient repetition of care and presence. The bear cub couldn't understand Harold's words, but it learned to recognize the tone of his voice, the sound of his footsteps, and the rhythm of his daily routines. Harold, in turn, learned to read the subtle signs of the cub's moods and needs, the way it would position its ears when it was content, the small sounds it made when it was hungry or seeking attention. The first times became sacred moments in their trust-building journey, each one marking a milestone in their unusual friendship. The first time the bear cub opened its eyes and looked at him without immediate fear was a victory Harold celebrated silently. The first time it voluntarily approached him instead of cowering in the corner brought tears to his eyes. The first time it allowed him to touch its head without flinching felt like a privilege he had somehow earned. The first time it fell asleep beside his chair while he worked on a wood-carving project filled him with a profound sense of peace. Each milestone represented not just the cub's recovery, but Harold's own healing. For months after Maggie's death, he had questioned his value, wondered if his life had any remaining purpose. The bear cub answered those questions without words, simply by thriving under his care, by choosing to trust him, and by bringing life and energy back into spaces that had felt like tombs. A memorable and transformative event occurred during the cub's 6th week of recovery. Harold had been working on a small wooden toy, a simple carved bear that he thought might amuse his charge, when the energetic young animal knocked over his workbench in its enthusiasm to investigate. Among the items that crashed to the floor was Maggie's favorite porcelain mug, the delicate blue and white piece she'd used every morning for their 27 years of marriage. It shattered against the concrete floor with a sound that seemed to echo in Harold's soul. The rage that erupted from him surprised them both. Harold shouted with a fury that had been building for 2 years, all his grief and helplessness pouring out in a torrent of angry words. The bear cub immediately cowered in terror, trembling and backing into the farthest corner of the workshop. Its eyes were wide with fear and confusion. In that moment, Harold saw himself reflected in the animal's frightened gaze, a broken old man taking out his pain on an innocent creature that had done nothing but trust him. The sight of the cub's terror cut through his anger like cold water. Harold sank to his knees among the broken pieces of ceramic, his hands shaking as he realized what he had done. The mug could never be repaired, but the damage to trust might be even more permanent. He approached the cowering cub slowly, his voice gentling to barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, little one," he said, extending his hand palm up in a gesture of peace. "Daddy's not angry with you. It wasn't your fault." The word "daddy" slipped out unconsciously, and Harold felt something break open in his chest when he heard it. He hadn't called himself that since his own children were small, decades ago and 1,000 miles away. The bear cub remained pressed against the wall for several long minutes, its dark eyes watching Harold's every movement. Slowly, tentatively, it crept forward until it was close enough for Harold to gently stroke its head. The moment his fingers made contact with the soft fur, the cub leaned into his touch, and Harold felt forgiveness flow between them like a current. That evening, as they sat together by the fire, Harold in his chair and the cub curled up on the floor beside him, the old ranger understood that the lesson had been as much for him as for the animal. Grief could make monsters of good people if they let it, but love and patience could heal even the deepest wounds. The broken mug remained broken, but the trust between them had not only survived but grown stronger. After many weeks of recovery, the bear cub had grown strong and vibrant, its coat thick and lustrous, its energy seemingly boundless. It had become a constant companion, following Harold through his daily routines, napping in the workshop while he worked, and playing with the wooden toys he carved for its amusement. But Harold's experience as a ranger told him what his heart didn't want to acknowledge. It was time to return the bear to its natural home. The decision to release the cub into the wild became the most difficult lesson Harold had ever faced about the nature of love. Everything in him wanted to keep this creature that had brought such joy and purpose back into his life. The rational part of his mind understood that keeping the bear would ultimately be cruel, that denying it its wild nature would serve only his own needs, not the animal's welfare. But knowing what was right didn't make the choice any easier. Harold spent sleepless nights planning the release, choosing a location deep enough in the forest to discourage the cub from returning, yet close enough to areas where other bears den that it might eventually find its own kind. He prepared gradually, first leaving the workshop door open for longer periods so the cub could explore outside, then taking longer walks together through the forest trails. Each outing seemed to awaken something primal in the young bear, as if the wild was calling it home. On the final morning, the bear cub seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. Instead of its usual playful energy, it moved with a quiet solemnity that suggested an understanding beyond its months. It came to Harold's side as he sat on the workshop steps, drinking what he knew would be their last coffee together. The bear settled beside him, not with the casual familiarity of their usual mornings, but with a deliberate presence that felt like ceremony. Harold looked into the cub's dark eyes and saw an intelligence there that took his breath away. This was no longer the half-dead creature he had rescued from the truck. This was a wild animal that had chosen to trust him, and now it was time to honor that trust by giving it back its freedom. He reached out and stroked the bear's head one final time, memorizing the texture of its fur, the warmth of its body, and the patient way it accepted his touch. "You're ready, aren't you, little one?" Harold whispered, and the bear's response was to lean against his leg with what felt like understanding. "You know it's time to go home." When Harold stood and walked toward the forest trail, the cub followed without hesitation. They walked together through the pine-scented morning, neither rushing nor lingering, both seeming to understand the gravity of their destination. Harold had chosen a clearing about 2 miles from his cabin, a place where several game trails converged and where he had often seen bear signs during his ranger days. At the edge of the clearing, Harold knelt and pulled the young bear into one final embrace. The animal submitted to this display of affection with unusual stillness, as if it too understood this was goodbye. Harold whispered words of blessing and hope, promises that the forest would take care of it, apologies for not being able to keep it safe forever. When he finally released the bear and stepped back, it looked at him for a long moment with eyes that held depths Harold couldn't fathom. Then, without looking back, it turned and loped into the forest with the fluid grace of its kind. Harold watched until the last flash of black fur disappeared among the trees, then stood alone in the clearing, his heart simultaneously broken and full. Many weeks passed in a silence that felt different from the loneliness Harold had known before the cub's arrival. This was not the hollow quiet of an empty life, but the peaceful stillness of someone who had given and received love, who had learned again what it meant to matter to another living being. He threw himself into projects that had languished for months, repairing the cabin shutters, organizing his workshop, even beginning to sort through some of Maggie's belongings that he had been unable to touch. The first signs that his act of love had been noticed by the forest came in small ways. Birds began frequenting his yard more often, as if word had spread that the old ranger's place was safe. A family of foxes took up residence under his shed, and he found their tracks each morning like signatures in the snow. These small visits filled him with a quiet satisfaction, though none could replace the profound connection he had shared with the bear cub. One afternoon in early spring, while Harold was repairing a section of fence at the forest edge where winter damage had left gaps that might tempt wandering wildlife, he suddenly felt the air around him change. The birds fell silent with an abruptness that made his ranger instincts scream danger. He looked up from his work to see a massive mountain lion emerging from the undergrowth barely 30 yards away. Its yellow eyes were fixed on him with the calculating stare of a predator that had found easy prey. Harold's blood turned to ice as he recognized his situation. Mountain lion attacks on humans were rare but not unheard of in this part of Colorado, especially when the big cats were young and hungry or old and desperate. This one appeared to be neither. It was a prime adult, probably male based on its size, and it moved with the confident fluidity of an apex predator in its element. Harold was too far from his cabin to make a run for it, too old and slow to outmaneuver the cat, and his rifle was leaning against the porch rail 100 yards away. The mountain lion began to move closer, its muscles coiling and relaxing with each step in the hypnotic rhythm of a hunter closing in for the kill. Harold forced himself to stand still, knowing that running would trigger the cat's chase instinct and seal his fate. He tried to make himself appear larger, raising his arms and speaking in the firm, authoritative voice he'd used to scare off bears during his ranger days, but the mountain lion was unimpressed. It continued its advance, its eyes never leaving Harold's face. Just as Harold was certain he was about to become another cautionary tale about the dangers of living alone at the edge of the wilderness, a black shadow erupted from the forest behind him. His heart nearly stopped when he recognized the bear, no longer a cub, but a juvenile approaching adult size, its muscles rippling beneath a coat that gleamed with health and vitality. This was his bear, grown strong and wild, returning at the moment of Harold's greatest need. The confrontation that followed was like something from a nature documentary, primal and violent and beautiful in its ferocity. The bear charged the mountain lion with a roar that echoed off the mountainsides, its claws extended and its teeth bared in fierce protection of the human who had saved its life. The mountain lion, caught completely off guard by this unexpected challenge, spun to face this new threat with a scream of frustrated rage. What followed was several minutes of the most intense wildlife combat Harold had ever witnessed. The bear, though smaller than the mountain lion, fought with the desperate courage of a creature defending its family. It used its superior agility to avoid the cat's slashing claws while landing powerful blows with its own formidable weapons. The mountain lion, accustomed to hunting prey that fled rather than fought back, found itself engaged in a battle it had never intended to fight. Blood darkened the fur of both animals as they grappled and separated, circled and clashed again. The bear took several deep scratches along its shoulders and flanks, but it managed to land a devastating blow across the mountain lion's face that sent the big cat reeling. The sound of their combat, the roars, screams, and heavy breathing, created a symphony of violence that seemed to shake the very trees. Finally, the mountain lion made the calculation that survival was more important than pride. Bloodied and confused by the unexpected resistance, it broke off the engagement and bounded away into the forest, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The bear watched it go with heaving sides and bared teeth, ready to resume the fight if necessary. But the threat had passed. In the sudden quiet that followed, Harold and the bear looked at each other across the small clearing. The animal's sides rose and fell with labored breathing, and Harold could see the dark lines of blood matting its fur where the mountain lion's claws had found their mark. But the bear's eyes no longer held the innocent trust of the cub Harold had raised. These were the eyes of a wild animal that had chosen to risk its life for reasons that transcended the simple mathematics of survival. Harold felt tears streaming down his cheeks as he understood what had just happened. The bear had not saved him out of gratitude alone, but out of something deeper, a bond that connected them across the species divide, a recognition of the love that had passed between them during those crucial weeks of healing. This was the forest's own version of reciprocity, the natural world acknowledging a debt and paying it in full. The bear looked at him for a long moment, its dark eyes seeming to communicate volumes that human language could never capture. Then, with what Harold could only interpret as a gentle nod, a gesture so human-like it took his breath away, the bear turned and limped back into the forest, disappearing among the trees as if it had never been there at all. Harold stood alone in the clearing for a long time after the bear had gone, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hands shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and emotion. The fence repair was forgotten. He walked slowly back to his cabin, marveling at the profound connection he had just witnessed, the way love could transcend every boundary that seemed to separate one life from another. Many months passed before Harold saw the bear again. And when he did, the encounter filled his heart with a joy so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. It was a beautiful autumn morning, the kind where the air was crisp enough to carry sounds for miles, and the aspens had turned the mountainsides into a patchwork of golden green. Harold was checking his mailbox at the end of his long driveway when movement by the forest stream caught his eye. Through his binoculars, he watched a scene that seemed too perfect to be real. A family of bears was playing by the water's edge, a large female and two small cubs that tumbled over each other with the carefree energy of youth. But it was the male bear that made Harold's breath catch even at a distance. He recognized the distinctive white patch on its chest and the particular way it held its massive head. This was his bear, now fully grown into a magnificent adult, teaching its own offspring the skills they would need to survive in the wild. Harold watched for nearly an hour as the bear family went about their morning routine. The father bear demonstrated fishing techniques to the cubs, his patience with their clumsy attempts reminiscent of the gentleness Harold remembered from their time together. When one of the cubs grew frustrated and began to whine, the father bear nuzzled it with obvious affection, encouraging it to try again. As if sensing Harold's presence, the father bear suddenly looked up from the stream, its gaze finding Harold across the distance with unerring accuracy. For a moment, time seemed suspended as they regarded each other, the old man and the bear whose lives had become intertwined in ways that defied explanation. Then the bear raised its massive head in what could only be described as a nod of acknowledgement, a solemn greeting between old friends. Harold raised his own hand in response, a gesture of blessing and farewell. The bear watched him for another moment, then gently herded its family deeper into the forest, leading them away from the human world and back into the wild sanctuary where they belonged. Harold lowered his binoculars with tears of pure happiness streaming down his cheeks, knowing that the circle of life had completed itself in the most beautiful way possible. This experience marked the beginning of Harold's complete transformation from a man consumed by grief to someone who had found new purpose in service to the natural world. He began a tradition that would define the remainder of his years. Each autumn, as winter approached and food became scarce, he would place carefully selected provisions at various points along the forest's edge, not just for bears, but for all the wildlife that struggled through Colorado's harsh winters. Harold researched the nutritional needs of different species, consulting with current rangers and wildlife biologists to ensure his offerings would help rather than harm. He set up feeding stations for deer, left suet for birds, and created salt licks that would benefit elk and moose. Each feeding station was positioned carefully to avoid creating dependency or drawing animals too close to human habitation. Word of Harold's kindness spread through the ranger network and local community like ripples on still water. Young rangers began stopping by his cabin for advice, drawn by stories of the legendary forest ranger who had found a way to give back to the wilderness that had shaped his life. Local residents, inspired by his example, began contributing supplies and time to what gradually became a community-wide effort. The story of Harold and the bear cub became a local legend, told and retold around campfires and in ranger stations throughout the region. Each telling added new layers of meaning, but the core message remained constant: true love requires sacrifice. Genuine connection transcends all boundaries. And the natural world remembers and repays kindness in its own mysterious ways. Children in nearby towns grew up hearing about the old ranger who had saved a bear cub and been saved in return. The tale became a teaching story about compassion, about the responsibility humans bear toward the wild creatures with whom they share the land. Conservation groups adopted Harold's model, establishing similar feeding programs in other areas where harsh winters threaten wildlife populations. Harold lived to see his small act of compassion grow into a network of care that extended throughout the Rocky Mountain region. The annual winter feeding program became institutionalized with funding from wildlife agencies and support from volunteer organizations. What had begun as one man's response to a bear cub's cry for help had evolved into a systematic approach to wildlife conservation that would outlive its founder by generations. Every evening, as Harold sat on his porch with his coffee and watched the sun set behind the mountains, he no longer felt the crushing loneliness that had nearly destroyed him after Maggie's death. The forest was alive around him with the sounds of creatures that knew they were safe in this place. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind was still, he imagined he could hear an echo of that original cry that had led him to the bear cub, not a sound of distress now, but a song of gratitude that rose from the forest floor and disappeared into the stars. Harold understood that his life had been shaped by two great loves, his decades with Maggie, which had taught him the depths of human connection, and his brief time with the bear cub, which had shown him that love could bridge any divide. Both had required him to give more than he thought he had to offer, and both had returned that gift multiplied beyond measure. As he grew older and his steps became slower, Harold knew that somewhere in the vast wilderness beyond his porch, friendship and gratitude still existed in forms that transcended words. The bear he had saved was thriving, raising its own family, passing on not just a genetic heritage but perhaps some memory of kindness received.